Hey, welcome everybody. Enjoying the winter? It's
Yeah.
nice, huh? All right.
Yeah.
Canadian winter.
Yeah.
Canadian winter is God's way of telling us we should make Aliyah. That's my theory. I'm reminded of it every year at this time.
So then what's going on in Jerusalem now?
Exactly.
How
Nothing compared to this. And by the way, it's kind of a fun thing because it's going to disappear. It's a moment of difficulty, I agree.
No, it was a
But
big difficult.
It was a
The floods were much worse than the snow. Floods were much worse than the snow.
floods were lost.
That's different. That's different, right?
Yeah.
The snow, you know, I had a friend who lives south of Jerusalem. And the first year he made Aliyah, it snowed in Jerusalem. He drove to Jerusalem, filled up the trunk of his car with snow, and drove home to have a snowball fight with his kids.
Melted.
Because they were missing it. No, he got back in time.
Okay.
He got back in time. So,
Oh well.
the snow is a little different there. Okay, so today we're going to move on from Rechav, right? For those people who are interested in the assignment of Rechav, we're moving forward now. We'll speak about her a bit, and then we're going to look at the bigger picture as well as we move forward. Okay. So where we left off was Rechav had made her own decision to change her life and to switch sides, so to speak. Whether she made a decision to switch sides pragmatically, gee, the other side is going to win, so I'm switching sides, or whether she made it because she was so impressed about what the force that she had run into, is not clear yet, but it'll become clear soon. What changed Rechav? Before this encounter, all that Rechav knew about the Jewish people were that they were potent political military power. Right? They had overturned the greatest empire in history, right, up to that date. Actually, maybe even since that date. The Egyptian empire went on for over 1,500 years. I think it was nearly 2,500 years between from the beginning of the Egyptian empires until its final collapse. And this group of slaves had turned it over and left with the wealth of Egypt. Right? Everybody they encountered who didn't make peace with them, they decimated. You know, the people who were literally giants, Sichon and Og, they decimated. They destroyed their nations. And now they stood across from Jericho. And it was clear to Rechav that the people of Jericho didn't have the stomach for the fight. That they were shaking in terror. And we know that, you know, when we read the Song of the Sea, it tells the reaction of the world to this news of the Jews coming out of Egypt and the power of their God, and that the nation shook with fear. And now this nation was coming out of the desert into a land that they viewed as their own, and they were going to take it by force. Where was she in this? Right. She knew all about their military prowess, but now she recognized for the first time the source of their strength was in their moral strivings. Now, not long before, there was somebody else who recognized that this was their strength, right? It was Bilam. That's right, Bilam, right? And of course, he understood that it is also their, to take a term from another society, their Achilles heel. That their strength was that their God was a moral God, and that he loved them because they were moral. And Bilam said, we'll never defeat them. It's not possible unless their God basically forsakes them. And their God will only forsake them if they behave in immoral ways. Now, Bilam misjudged. You know, God would penalize us, but he will never forsake us. Right? You know, David Melech, in probably the most famous of all Psalms, Psalm 23, it says, thy rod and thy staff, they comfort me. The staff is something that supports a walker. You know, a person who's walking long distances, he has a walking staff, right? But the rod is something you prod cattle with. It's something you hit things with, right? And somehow David is saying, that both of these things are a comfort to me. Right? And he understands that regardless of his sin, he'll get his punishment, but his relationship with God will not be reduced. Right? He'll pay a price, but he'll move on. Right?
It's not indifference. It's a...
Bilam thought he could flip a switch. Right? Make them do immoral acts, God will forsake them, you can destroy them. Right? He was wrong. Right?
Why did he think that way? He underestimated God?
So the question was, what did Bilam get wrong? Right? And I think you asked, did he underestimate God? Right? No, he didn't underestimate God. He actually understood the situation. Right? And that was God's attraction to the Jewish people, among other things, was that they were moral people. You remember Bilam observed that they, when they built their camp so that the front of their tents would never face each other, that they wouldn't look into another person's privacy. Right? So Bilam was aware of that. And Bilam understood that this was something that God cherished. And keep in mind that God was very angry about what happened at Shittim. I shouldn't personalize God's emotions, but he severely penalized the Jews. 24,000 people died in a plague as a result of it. It was not, everything was normal, right? It would seem that they came very close, right? But we understand that God made a covenant with Abraham, Yitzhak, and Yaakov, and that covenant cannot be abrogated as long as both sides of the covenant exist, regardless of the behavior of the covenant. Right? So, yes.
Could it be because when God made a covenant, he actually saw future and past and whatever at once?
We assume that. Yeah, we assume in God's case that...
if something will come up, because God knew exactly what came up.
Yeah, no, it's fair to assume, but we get into a very complicated conversation if you go there between free will and predestination. But certainly we don't think that God is surprised by the behavior of people. Right? That's I think a given. And that timelines don't exist for God, as he is the creator of time itself. Right? But in this case, what I think Bilam didn't take into account was, one is that this is not necessarily a vengeful God. This is a God who loves this people, number one. This is a God who has made a promise to the Avos. He will not break that promise. It's a very poor example. And as you know, when God threatens to, the response that Moshe has to it is very strong arguments about what will the world see in you if you avoid this promise, right? And by the way, if you destroy those that are creators of a stool that stood on 3 legs, Abraham, Yitzhak, and Yaakov, you think it's going to stand on a stool with 1 leg? Moshe? It's not going to happen. Right? So even the threat of God voiding the covenant is not a real threat at the end of the day. Clearly God wanted Moshe to make the case, but in a sense it wasn't necessary. The Jews had descended to the 49th level of Tumah. They were idol worshippers. They didn't keep bris milah. There were a lot of reasons why God might have made the argument that this covenant doesn't exist. When they crossed the Yam Suf, the Malachim made an argument. They said, they're idol worshippers and they're idol worshippers. Why are you saving them? Right? But the answer is clear. Right? The nature of a covenant is that as long as both sides exist, that covenant is in place. So, for instance, in our own lives, right? You buy insurance from a company, right? So when you buy insurance from a company, it has a board of directors. Right? Over the 50 years of that insurance policy, none of the members of the first board of directors are still on the board of directors.
Right.
When they came on the board of directors, they were already senior people in their 50s. 50 years later, if they're alive, they're in their hundreds, right? They're not on the board of directors, right? But your contract for that insurance remains exactly in place. No change, right? It's not affected by individuals. It's affected by entities. There was an entity to the covenant which was represented by Moshe, by Abraham, Yitzhak, and Yaakov, which was the Jewish people. There was another part of that covenant represented by God. As long as they both continued to exist in some form, right, the covenant was in place, and they would be protected. That's clear. It's part of the value of the fact that although the Jews certainly didn't practice their religion in any great numbers outside of the Levium, that they became pagan idol worshippers, that they were not keeping kashrus, that they were not keeping bris milah. We know they kept their names, they kept their clothes, they kept their language. Right. They were today what people might call cultural Jews. Right? Every Sunday they had bagel with cream cheese. Right? They knew a couple of Yiddish words. Right? They did things that were sort of Jewish at times, kosher style. Right? And before we jump at making fun of those ideas, we should understand that they're very important. That they are part of preserving the cultural side of Judaism. They will not last forever, right? With a decline, they will eventually be absorbed, and we see some of the sad results of that over time. But by the way, some of the good news of it is some of the people who had no religious background but had this kind of cultural Judaism are the focus of the Hosea B'Teshuvah movement, the people coming back to Judaism.
But they
in this case, right, the fact that they were cultural Jews, right, was enough for God to be required to keep the covenant. That was enough.
Do we know the minimum requirement?
I'm not sure.
Because if it's a Jewish clothing, not too many wearing, togas.
I'm not sure exactly what the requirement. But they were identifiably Jewish. Nobody thought that they were Thebans, right? By the way, the possible exception to that was Moses.
Yeah.
Remember, when Moses comes to Yithro, he's identified as an Egyptian. Mm-hmm. Who is this Egyptian, right? Because he spoke the language of the Egyptians, and he wore Egyptian clothes, right? And he had an Egyptian name. Right?
That's very interesting.
He was the exception to all these rules. Right?
My question was, are we still qualified?
Yes.
As a nation,
the covenant is still in place.
Observant, but 90%...
The covenant is still in place. And nobody has a doubt who the Jews in this world are.
Because
either us or them.
Defines you as a Jew. Is it enough for God?
One of the tragedies of our history is sometimes we're reminded of our Jewishness in a way that's very unpleasant. But it seems that part of the deal with God is He doesn't let us forget who we are, even if we want to. It's not something we're permitted to do. So we remain a nation. We're going to come to the national aspect of it, because one of the things that defines a nation, in fact, is their land. We don't have nations that don't have land.
You don't have what?
That don't have land.
Oh, yeah.
Right? We have governments in exile. The Dalai Lama is a government of Tibet in exile. But Tibet is a piece of land at the end of the day, and the Tibetans live on that land. So that's one of the unique qualities of the Jews, is they were able to remain a nation without a land for very long periods of time. But we'll get to that soon. So to get back on the subject about what it was that she recognized was this power and this force, right? The expression of Tehillim sort of rings, some with chariots and some with horses, but we call out in the name of Hashem our God. Right? She recognized further the impotence of her own customers, not just because of the fear of the impending conquest of Israel, but by the dampening of the desire for the sin caused merely by the proximity of Israel. The power of having Israel camped across the way, not simply the military power, but the very moral quality of the camp that was over there, that it was not something that was corruptible, was perceived by the Canaanites as really the writing on the wall. They knew that this is not a force we can deal with at all. And Rechav, of course, recognized this, as the expression goes in journalism, up close and personal. Mm-hmm. What a profound influence the Jewish people can have on the whole world. Simply the presence of a holy person, group, or nation elevates the moral level of all whom they contact. This is actually half true, right? It can do that, but it can have exactly the opposite effect as well. There's an idea of thesis, antithesis, and synthesis, right? So if the thesis is moral Judaism and the antithesis is pagan idol worship, and I just want to repeat something we said before. A very important part of pagan idol worship is not a religious thing. It's an entertainment thing. It is
sensual.
What was the Roman god of...
Хлеба и зрелищ. Yeah, the bread and entertainment.
No, the god.
Dionysium?
Yeah, it was Dionysian, right? The religious practice was orgiastic, right? So when we talk about Judaism and paganism, right, we're not simply talking about two different forms of idol worship. The Jewish view of the holy quality of sexuality, right, was very controlled and very specific to the marriage and to the home, right? The pagan one was almost the opposite, and that it was part of the religion. It was a big part of the religion. Temple prostitutes, temple orgies, all those things. So what can happen is one of two things. You can have the synthesis and the antithesis, that is to say, Judaism and Dionysian system, right? And then a synthesis where the Dionysians become much less orgiastic and start to say, well, maybe there's some value in self-respect. Maybe there's some value in honoring, what God has given us, right?
And Judaism become a little bit more fun.
The nice thing about Judaism is, unlike other religions, it's not one that bars, as you put it, fun. It actually encourages fun, but under certain specific things, so that fun will have a lasting impact.
It's not the fun.
It's not the fun. No, it's not required for synthesis. That's what I'm saying. It's not the fun of a roller coaster ride that ends, after 6 minutes of tremendous excitement. It's the fun of knowing that you can have a unique, loving, sexually exciting experience that goes on indefinitely forever with one person under certain terms, right? That you can be completely fulfilled. Right, and there's secrets to how you do it built into the laws of Judaism.
The monogamy,
right? So what the people in orgies were searching for, right? Judaism actually provided, and the orgies didn't provide. That's actually the secret of the whole thing. All the orgies did was provide a desire for the next orgy, right? The laws of family purity in Judaism provided for satisfaction, right, and an ongoing desire for exactly what you had. That was the difference between the two, right? Rechav, coming back to her, is an expert, and now an expert in understanding these differences, right? Something has changed, right? The Canaanite knew the Jews were coming, and that alone diminished their ardor for sin. And even Rechav her business was falling apart, right? And even Rechav was persuaded to abandon her chosen profession. In the presence of the spiritual might of Israel, they were no longer the same people, spiritually or militarily, the Canaanites. At the moment of her transformation, Rechav merited divine inspiration. So this is suddenly an understanding that this wasn't just a pragmatic decision, right? And if it was a pragmatic decision, then it went way beyond the pragmatism of it very quickly. And she was able to direct the spies to safety and foretell the outcome of their mission. Clearly, like many wicked people, Rechav had tremendous spiritual potential that was latent and never actualized up to this point. When they rectify their path, the Rasha, right, they can become great tzaddikim, righteous people with enormous spiritual sustenance.
Every wicked person has a potential?
Absolutely. And
the wickeder they
in some ways, exactly. In some ways, the more wicked, the greater the potential if they do teshuvah ba'ava. Right? There's two ways to change your life. You change your life because you say, I've been so evil that when I step out of my house, I'm going to be hit by a bus, struck by lightning, right? And I'm telling God, if I change my life, right, promise me you won't strike me with lightning, right? Because I saw my best friend got hit by lightning last week, and he was as decadent as I am, right? That kind of tshuva has great merit because the person's changed their life. But whatever their averas are, right, they can be forgiven in the averas, but their life is devoid of mitzvot. Right? You know, a person who is Hosei b'tshuva, who returns at the age of, say, 40, right? So it may be that his averas prior to that point are washed away. It's possible that that's true, if his tshuva is very real and if he wasn't aware of the significance of what he was doing. But the 27 years that he didn't say Shema twice a day, he'll never get credit for that. Can't happen, right? The averas he should have done, he can't get credit for. It may be the mitzvahs he shouldn't have done, he'll never get credit for. The averas that he did may be washed away in some manner, in some form. But we know from Chazal, I think it's from Perkei Avos, from the Mishnah, that a person who does true tshuva out of love of God, his mitzvahs, his averas become mitzvahs. I don't understand that entirely, but it's a comfort to many of us. And the truth of the matter is that maybe it's part of the expression that we see in many places, that the tzaddik Gomer, the perfect tzaddik, can't stand in the place of the Baalei Tshuva. Now, by the way, Baalei Tshuva means a master of tshuva. You know, there aren't that many people who actually get to that. It's an expression we throw around. Someone who's working on it is probably more realistic for most of us. But that means that somebody who had done a series of averas, right, when he makes this change for the right reasons, suddenly he's banked all kinds of mitzvahs that he didn't realize he had because of this change. Now, you understand where that puts Rachav, right?
Yeah.
You know, she's like one of the most righteous, right? And by the way, we should note that it says 8 prophets descended from her, Nevi'im, right? And if you want to look for another example, you can see it in Yithro. Yithro, it said, tried every avodah zarah. He experimented. He was an expert on avodah zarah. You know, when Paro said, I don't see the name Hashem in this book of avodah zarah, right? I always think it's Yithro who wrote that book. You know, when Moshe comes to Paro says, you know, why are you here? Moshe says, I'm sent by Yud-Kei Vav-Kei, right? The God of Israel, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Joseph, and Yaakov. And it says, the Medrash tells us that Paro kind of looked through his book, and he had a book of list of all the gods of the ancient world. Yud. He's not here. He says, Moshe, I don't know this Yud-Kei Vav-Kei. Right? I don't know it, right? So, of course, the reason he didn't know it was that the gods that Paro was aware of were the gods that emerged from the universe, not the God from which the universe emerged. The gods he knew were in one ballpark, and he was part of those gods himself, Paro. The God Moshe Rabbeinu was talking about was in a different league. It was not, they weren't even in the same stratosphere, right? But when it said that, you know, he looked through his Encyclopedia of Gods, I always think that the author of this encyclopedia was probably Yithro, right? But Yithro came to an understanding after all this research that there is but one God, right? And he also had tremendous merit, and his children, you know, were part of the Sanhedrin, etc., right? And he had the merit to be the father-in-law of Moses himself. So, and the advisor to Moses, right? He gives Moses a lot of advice, right? So, clearly, if you make tshuva for the right reasons, that the experience that you had in the past becomes great value in a different way. Right? So let's continue. The Canaanites knew the Jews were coming, and that alone diminished their ardor for sin. And even Rachav was persuaded to abandon her chosen profession in the presence of the spiritual might of Israel. They were no longer the same people, spiritually or militarily, the Canaanites. Jericho was, a tremendously powerful city. Its walls were broad. It was a feared city. At the moment of her transformation, Rachav merited divine inspiration and was able to direct the spies to the safety and foretell the outcome of their mission. She was able to tell them that for sure you will be successful. Right? You will breach the walls. You will destroy Jericho. Right? Clearly, like many wicked people, Rachav had tremendous spiritual potential that was latent and never actualized. But when they rectify their path, they can become great tzaddikim, righteous people with enormous spiritual substance. The greatest rasha, wicked person, who possesses great reservoirs of spiritual energy, can become a great tzaddik once he is transformed and his energy is redirected. Right? In order to be a great rasha, you have to have great spiritual power. Right? You're a great force. We know that the evil that we've seen in our own lifetimes, right, has a spiritual element to it. It's very powerful. It's not just...
it's usually kind of very charismatic people who was able to ignite the nations and lead the nations.
Yeah. There's a note here. The Maharal explains that this is the intent of the Gemara in Gittin that states, some of Haman's descendants learned Torah in Bnei Brak, and some of Sisera's descendants taught Torah to the children in Yerushalayim. The source of great evil has the potential to become the source of even greater good. It's the Maharal. Right? Rav Nathan Tzvi Finkel, who passed away, I think, 2 years ago. He was the Rosh Hashiva of Mir. Used to like to quote the Alter Slobodka. Slobodka. Yeah. He would say that he could not guarantee that his disciples would never sin. He could not make such a guarantee. But he could guarantee that they would never enjoy their sins. That's it. The influence of holiness extends far beyond its immediate vicinity, and that indeed its eternal calling of the Jewish people to be a catalyst for holiness and morality in this world. The word tzaddik also applies most famously to Yosef, right? Mm-hmm. And in the midst of his greatest temptation, it seems that his father's face appeared to him. Mm-hmm. Whether it was an image that he created himself, a reflection in a window of himself, whatever it was, that image in Yosef's mind was enough to say, I'm not going further on this path, I'm out of here.
Right.
I remember. So, even the tools of promiscuity can be consecrated for a higher purpose. Right? The same rope and window used by Rachav's customers, she used to enable the spies to escape. Rachav said to God, with these I sinned, so with these forgive me. No person could be as immoral as Rachav. She knew it all. Most of us do not have the time or the energy, says the author. Yet when she was transformed, Rachav merited Ruach HaKodesh, divine inspiration, and eventually married Yehoshua himself. Mm-hmm. If the task of the Jewish people is to bring the nations to acknowledge the sovereignty of God in the world, then Rachav represented the ultimate conquest of the Jewish idea. Someone recognized by non-Jewish society as the antithesis of morality, who was then elevated through the attainment of ideas and virtues to the highest stratum of the Jewish people, the ancestress of prophets. Now, by the way, this idea of changing tools of immorality to tools of morality is a very, very famous incident in the building of the Mishkan that deals with this. Does anybody know what I'm talking about?
Mirrors?
Yeah. The kior itself, the washing basin for the Kohanim, was uniquely created. Right? It was created by the mirrors of the women. Right? this week's Parsha, it says Yeshua, but this week's Parsha deals specifically with this, with Puah and Shifra, and the nature of the Jewish women, and it is because of them that eventually the Jews were redeemed from Egypt. But when it came time to build the Mishkan, the women came forward with their brass mirrors, right? Or copper mirrors, polished mirrors of polished metal. I think it was copper, actually. Copper, yeah. And they brought them to Moshe Rabbeinu and said, you can use these, right? And Moshe Rabbeinu knew what these mirrors were for. These mirrors were created so that when the women would go out into the fields, after a tremendously hard day's work themselves, in gardens and stuff like that, doing very, very hard work, or even brickwork, right? They were determined not to let the Mitzri snuff out the Jewish venture. Their husbands had already given up. Their husbands said, we shouldn't go forward with this. We shouldn't have children. And they would go to them in the fields after having, cleaned themselves up and made themselves look beautiful, and with these mirrors, and they would show their husbands and say, look here. I think today it's called a selfie. Right? I think it's called a selfie, right? And there's this picture of the President Obama taking a picture of himself with a Danish woman, right? Yeah. So it was the original selfie, right? A wife would come to her husband and say, don't we look nice together? We should be together.
Yeah.
Let's put this behind us, this mishigas of yours. Let's create a nation. Let's be together. And he would look in the mirror and say, well,
why not?
I'm not so bad, and she's good looking. There's something here that's important, spiritual, and it would be successful. But for Moshe Rabbeinu, when they came to him with the mirrors, he said, these are instruments of seduction.
Yeah.
This is not appropriate for the holies, as a thing that you would use for cleaning yourself before you would do the avoda of worship for the Kohanim. And God said exactly the opposite. And the kior is a very unique thing for a number of reasons. First of all, how big was the kior supposed to be? We know that there's details, how long the poles are for the aron, the size of the menorah, the shape of the shulchan. How big did God say that the size of the kior should be? Does anybody know? Another word for it is a laver. It should be as big as the mirrors that are donated. Every mirror should be used, number one. And number two, they shouldn't be melted down. For instance, the menorah was made of solid gold. Right? Solid gold, carved, molded, whatever. I won't get into the details of it, right? But how did it happen? People brought their gold.
Yeah, I don't know.
They put it into a cauldron. It melted, and they made however you make it from that point. But nobody could say, that was that flower on the menorah came from Shmuel's gold, and that came from that, right? But no mirror was destroyed in making the kior. The mirrors individually were welded together to create the kior. Right? They weren't melted down, because you could have melted the copper down, created a mold for it, and made it that way. Right? That would have been no. God did not want them to be destroyed.
So what is the meaning of this?
The meaning of this is Moshe Rabbeinu know that those things that are used for seduction, if it's for a holy purpose, right? There's nothing wrong with them. It's a very positive thing. They should be part.
Besides that, it was
they said it was precious to me.
Yeah, it's precious to God. These mirrors. These mirrors were precious to God, right? In the case of Rechav, they were used for something very unholy, right? And by the way, there's another example of something like this, right? It's very interesting, right? God, is really Bal Tashlich. He doesn't waste anything. Right? So can anybody think of something else that was used for very wrong purposes that ended up being used for very holy purposes? What was the copper mizbeach made from? Does anybody know? The big mizbeach. The big, what's mizbeach? Altar. Right.
Is it iron? Is it metal?
It was made from the fire pans of Korach.
You're right.
What?
When Korach challenged Moshe and Aaron, Moshe said, there'll be a test tomorrow morning. Everybody who thinks they're qualified to be the Kohen Gadol will bring their fire. Right? And the way you brought your fire was on a pan with it burning. Right? And God will decide whose fire he will accept. Right? This was a big gamble, right, for Moshe, right? Because you're not generally supposed to use miracles to prove something. But it worked, right? And everybody except Aaron was destroyed. I forget, 100, 200 some odd people.
I think it's 200 people.
I think it was over 200 people were destroyed, right? So then the question was what to do with these fire pans of these people who were wrong, but who were bringing sacrifice to God, right? God said, you don't destroy those. Use those to be the top of the altar, to make the top of the altar. What do you use?
Because it's the idea, concept of hekdesh, something which designated for a holy purpose.
Exactly. That's
Even
right.
they were mistaken.
That's right. That's right.
But designation.
So Rachav, to come back to Rachav, right? She said, whatever it is, and I think this is more meaningful than simply a scarlet thread, right? She's saying, whatever my strengths are, right? My strengths in terms of understanding, politics. My strengths in terms of seduction. My strengths in terms of how I deal with the great and powerful, the mighty and the powerful, right? Let that be put to God's use in some way, right?
I think she stopped using. She herself was a vessel should become.
No, she stopped with Gilead Arias, which is a sin, right?
Yeah.
But by the way, obviously her sexuality continued because she became the wife of Joshua, right? So even that became for a holy purpose, right? But more than that, Rachav, we've learned already from what we learned over the previous weeks, was not just simply a harlot, right? She was, the Hollywood madam, the Washington madam. She was somebody who had access to the great and powerful, and she knew how to talk to them, and she knew how to advise them as well, right? She wasn't a stupid person, right? She was a very powerful person herself. And she decided to use all of that, right, in God's, rather than strip me of that, right, let's put it to the right purpose. I think that's the meaning of this idea, to, with these I have sinned, so with these forgive me, right? I'm going to make good, right? No person could be as...
She went to the top. That's why she went to the top.
Did she want to marry Joshua?
She went to the top. She knew how to behave.
Yeah, but by the way, if you want to stay with the parallel...
No, he came to say thank you very much, and next thing you know, it's...
We'll come to it later, okay? But I just want to say, if you stay with the parallel of Yithro, right? When Yithro decided he's done with pagan worship and that there is one God, not in the sense of Judaism, but the recognition, in a way, the same recognition that Abraham had, right? That there could only be one God, that's the only thing that makes sense, right? Then his position changed too, right? He wasn't just stripped of his previous idol worship as a Kohen, right, and his advice to Paro, as an advisor of Paro. He became not just the father-in-law of Moshe Rabbeinu, but really the major advisor of Moshe Rabbeinu is how to set up. We're the people of the book. We're the people of a great judicial tradition. That judicial system, for which Jews are famous to this day, it's right, Jewish lawyers, Jewish, right? Came through the recommendations of Yithro, right? Who had used that advice, for sure, in the court of Egypt. And now he said, I'll use it for this, right? And his reward was very great. Very great. Okay, so if the task of the Jewish people is to bring the nations to acknowledge the sovereignty of God in the world, Rachav represented the ultimate conquest of the Jewish idea. Someone recognized by non-Jewish society as the antithesis of morality, who was then elevated through the attainment of ideas and virtues to the highest stratum of the Jewish people, the ancestress of prophets themselves. In that accomplishment, she duplicated the role of Yitro, the priest of Midian and Moshe's father-in-law, who abandoned his idolatrous past and represented the presence of the non-Jewish world joined to the Jewish people in the service of God. Thus we have found that Rechav and Yitro are linked conceptually by Chazal several times, as Rechav was the follower and the natural successor of Yitro.
Mm-hmm. A timeline, yeah, it's after.
Yeah, I mean, Yitro comes early on.
Yeah,
to them,
just
right?
But
this one with Rachav, it's already after Moshe's death.
Yeah,
nearly 40 years spent.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, it's roughly 40 years.
Yeah.
Right?
Mm-hmm.
But by the way, she was keeping track of what was going on the whole time. Right? During this time, she was very aware that the Jews had left Egypt and they're in desert.
But my understanding, everybody were aware. It's where East
was that's right.
But she didn't sign up then.
It was on Facebook at that point. They're on the 45th stop on the road. Right. They're coming close. Okay, so now let's move on. Right? The question that remains is, why is it necessary for the Jewish people to have a land that we call our own? Right? And this, of course, is the heart of where we are today. Right? A land that has to be conquered and constantly defended. Many religions operate without land of their own. Christianity today lacks a particular land. Islam, it seems...
What do you mean? It's opposite. It encompasses a lot of lands.
No, there isn't a country that is called the Christian country. There used to be. The Vatican is the closest thing to it. But it's not really a country. It's Central Park.
No, I would say opposite. I would say Malaysia, it's an Islamic country. We call it the whole...
No, it's an Islamic country, but it is not necessarily...
Thank you.
Its designation is not the exclusive home of the Muslim people. Right. Well, let me just read a little bit further, and I think we'll address this in a second. Christianity today lacks a particular land. Islam, it seems, lays claim to everyone's land. That's my wife's answer. But why must Jews have a land that is uniquely ours? We have Shabbos, kashrus laws, laws of family purity, prayer and study of Torah. So why do we also require a land for our ethical message to go forth to mankind? Now, it's interesting because this question I don't think would have ever been asked at the time of the destruction of the Beis Hamikdash. If somebody had said to the Jews, you don't need the temple, you don't need Israel, right? Everything's going to be okay, right? I think they would have said, that's an outrageous idea. We are a nation, we are a people, we have tribal territories, we have government, we have a judicial system. What do you mean we don't need it? We can manage without it, right? Now, it turns out, of course, interestingly enough, that for 2,000 years, the Jews, as a nation, survived without a land. They yearned for a land, they had a memory of a land, they prayed for a land, they had a passion for a land, but they didn't have the land. And they certainly, those that were on the land...
They didn't have it physically.
And they didn't have the land. I'm talking about physical land, the place where you put a house, right? Yeah. And what presence they had on the land had no autonomy to it. Whoever it was, they were serving somebody else. There was no Jewish control of that space. For 2,000 years. And yet they survived. And there is really no examples of this in history. When nations are defeated, they are absorbed into other nations. That's the nature of history. Right? In fact, there's a very interesting book called The Jew in the Lotus. I think I may have mentioned it before.
The Jew
in the Lotus. Right? The jewel in the lotus is a yoga position of Buddhism.
That's right.
The Jew in the Lotus is a fascinating book written about a non-religious Jew, written by a non-religious Jew who went through a lot of changes in the process of writing the book. The Dalai Lama was very anxious to meet with rabbis, very anxious to have a meeting with rabbis. And the rabbis were very interested to meet the Dalai Lama. Why? For the rabbis, it was simple. So many young Jews seemed to be seeking their spiritual fulfillment in Buddhism at the time. This was in the 70s, 60s, remember the Beatles, right?
Yeah, all going in there.
But especially Jews, right? And by the way, there are, Jews who are high lamas as part of the Dalai Lama's community today.
Leonard Cohen, the Buddhist.
Yeah,
Zen.
right. Jubu. It expresses Jubu, right? So the rabbis, there were among them one Orthodox rabbi, but it was a great variety of people with some kind of rabbinic recognition. And what they wanted to know was, what is the draw that the Dalai Lama has for these people in Buddhism that we don't have? And how can we remedy this? But that's not what I want to talk about. What I want to talk about is, what was the Dalai Lama's motive? Why did he want to meet the rabbis? I know why the rabbis wanted to meet him. So it's brilliant. Who is the Dalai Lama? To some, he's a living God. But he's also the high priest of Zen Buddhism. Right?
He is son of the living God.
Yeah.
To some, he's a living God.
To some, not
to some. To some, he is a living God.
But Buddha wasn't God.
What?
No, the way they are choosing here,
he is a deity that is reincarnated. I don't want to go into the whole detail of it. Just take my word for this. Just take my word for this, okay? And when the Dalai Lama passes on, they will search for his soul among a young child again, right? And there's a process of recognition, etc. It's quite interesting. But I don't think we need to go into that. The point is, from a political point of view, the Dalai Lama was the priest, the chief priest, the chief prophet of a small nation that was a religiously based nation with a priestly class, right, that was conquered by a mighty nation. He was pushed out of the country.
And it was temple-based.
And he lives in, and temple-based, with sacrifices attached to it. And he lives in exile. I don't want to say gullus, but certainly exile. Right? And he's getting old. And he's going to pass on. And he has a mission that his people not be destroyed culturally, religiously. Behind him is a very, or was at the time, a very reactionary priesthood. What we did before, we do now. Right? The Dalai Lama was a man of the world. He was looking around to see what the solutions were. And he said to himself, now, if we're going to be in exile and survive until the Chinese finally give up on this, and then we'll return to Lhasa, rebuild our temple, have our sacrifices, right? Be a nation again. Who would know how to do that? Who would know how to survive without your land? Without all the symbols? Who would know how to change the faith so that it can survive without the temple in lands all over the world?
Hello?
Let me think. Well, there's one group who did this, right? For 2,000 years, temple-based Judaism disappeared. Right? Who's a Kohen today? He's the guy with the first aliyah. He's the guy who you asked to bench, lead benching, right? He doesn't have any big day kahuna, any uniform. He's not doing any sacrifices. God willing, tomorrow he will. The temple will be rebuilt and he will, right? But so the Dalai Lama was trying to seek a solution to this. Right? The Jews uniquely survived without a land, and people would make an argument maybe it's not necessary. But we know from our prayers, from our liturgy, from prophetic writings, everything, that this is not how it is supposed to be. That God allows us to survive this way is because He has a plan for a time when we do have the land back. So let's talk about that already. Many religions operate with a land of their own. Christianity today lacks particular land. Islam, it seems, lays claim to everybody's land.
Yeah.
Right? But why must Jews have a land that is uniquely ours? We have Shabbos, kashrus laws, family purity, prayer, and study of Torah. So why do we require a land of for our ethical message to go forth to mankind? You know, we had a lesson. Before I go on, I just want to mention last week's Parsha. We had a lesson in this last week. Last week, Yaakov had to face that Golus was coming, and that his children would have to survive the Golus without him. Right? And he took 2 of Joseph's sons, and he blessed them. And when he blessed them, it was a very strange blessing. Right? He said, first of all, the Jewish people will bless their sons this way. Right? Ephraim and Manasseh. And he put his right hand on Ephraim's head, and his left hand on Manasseh's. And Yosef said, Dad, you have it wrong. Tati, please, change that, right? And Yaakov said, I know exactly what I'm doing.
Because Yosef brought it to him and put it.
Yeah, he put Ephraim across from the right hand, because Ephraim is the older one. And we've had enough trouble in our family with older and youngers.
Manasseh's older.
Manasseh's older. Manasseh's older. Right? And Yosef understood. In our family, we've had enough trouble with people misplacing other people and showing favoritism. Right. Let's just do it the straight way. Yaakov said, no, this is how we're going to do it. But we learn from this a very interesting lesson. Right? It's a very important lesson. And the lesson is this, is that Manasseh is the older one, and Manasseh and Ephraim were very different. Ephraim spent his life learning with his grandfather, with Yaakov. Right? He wasn't living with Yosef, he was living with Yaakov. Manasseh was in Egypt. Manasseh was the right hand of Yosef. He was, in a sense, the third most powerful person in Egypt. Right? Whenever you see the assistant of the viceroy doing something in the stories, it's Manasseh. It's Manasseh who puts the silver in the thing. It's Manasseh who, arrests Shimon. It's Manasseh who arranges for the brothers to do it. It's always Manasseh, right? He's referred to as the assistant, right? But it's Manasseh. So these are 2 very different sons, right? One is, someone who's sitting and learning, right? And the other is nation building. When they're in the desert, there's a census taken, right? And by the way, they've been promoted to sons of Yaakov at this last moment.
That's right.
They're no longer grandsons of Yaakov,
no, he said,
right?
These are mine.
They're mine, right? They actually displace Levi and Yosef, right, and become tribes of their own. Yeah. Right? There's a census taken in the desert quite a few times. And if you look at it, every time the census is taken, Ephraim is mentioned first, even though he's the younger. Manasseh last, with one exception. One exception. When the division of the land is about to happen, the last census before they enter the land, Manasseh is counted first. Ephraim is counted after him. Right? Why is this? It comes back to crossing the hands. Right? What did Yaakov do? He gave his right hand to Ephraim and his left hand to Manasseh. The hand we associate with fine motor movements, with the intellect, with writing, right? But he gave his right side to Manasseh and his left side to Ephraim. That's why he didn't want to switch the boys. He wanted to cross his hands, because he wanted them each to have something very specific. The side of a person, the leg, the shoulder, is the physicality of the person. The fingertips, right, are, the learning, the fine attributes of the person. Manasseh was destined to be the nation builder of the 2. Ephraim to a very large degree, sustained us in Galus. Right? How do we in Thornhill express our Yiddishkeit? Think about it for a second. We learn, we go to shul, we keep mitzvahs, we have a community. We have a community, right?
I don't understand why Menashe, when it was the Eretz Israel was divided, why it was first?
Because Menashe's skills were more critical once you're in the land.
So what is to do with the side of the body?
The side of the body represents your physicality, your mobility, the things that you do outside of the Beis HaMikdash and the shul.
So why didn't he cross the hands?
Because he wanted Ephraim, who was the learner in the family, right, to have the blessing of the intellect, of the fine motor skills, of being able to be a sofer, to write things down. So through hands
you give the blessing of the intellect?
Yeah, through the right side. Through the right side, right? Remember, by the way...
Yeah, but it comes from the right side to the left side.
Right. Say again?
He just crossed the arms, but what does it matter? Because it's still coming from the right side.
No, he was giving him one quality of the right, but not the other quality of the right. He wasn't giving him the right side of the body. He was giving that to Ephraim, to Menashe. Right? He was only giving him the hand. If he wanted to give him all, he would have said, okay, put Ephraim on this side and put Menashe on this side, and I'll go like that.
Right. So the right
but he
side,
didn't.
So the right side of physicality
is physicality, right?
And the left side is spirituality.
No, not right side. Between hand and leg. Difference between right leg and right hand. Right hand, it's a strength. It's a hand connected with the learning. Leg connected with the material building.
With action.
Ruchnius and Gashmius. Ruchnius, it's a hand. Gashmius, it's a leg. He made the strong Ruchnius for Ephraim and weak Gashmius for Ephraim, because we don't have to, being in diaspora, we don't have to.
I wouldn't say weak, but not as strong.
Not as strong.
Yeah.
To Menashe gets strong Gashmius, because in the land of Israel, Rit Kanavu, the build whatever.
To build the land.
It's a Ruchnius too.
You understand that if everybody was Ephraim, in Israel, right? We wouldn't have roads. We wouldn't have an army. Mm-hmm. We wouldn't survive. We'd have everybody sitting in Kollel and nobody doing anything else. I don't want to get into this discussion. I know where this leads. I don't want to get into it, right? But clearly we need Ephraim and Menashe. Whatever the balance is, I don't want to get into all that conversation. Yeah. But clearly you need both of those qualities. And they represented two different qualities. And Yaakov's blessing was intended to represent those two qualities, right? And that's why just before they move into the land, what's more critical in Galus, right, is not as critical when it comes time to build the nation, right? Other things become more critical at that point.
And the children are blessed like this because you never know what this child will become. Is he going to become a businessman or he going to become
what do you mean they're blessed?
No, the children are blessed with both. Our children, when we bless our sons,
you
right?
Put both hands on
when we bless our sons, it's not that, but we bless them that you should be like Ephraim and Menashe.
Exactly.
Right.
Because we don't know what
Yaakov knew what they were going to be in his case, right? And he blessed them for their strengths, right? But when we do it,
because we don't know who they're going to be. Of course, they're going to be this or that.
We said to the girls and everything, we say all the names of the mothers and...
No, but all the names, they all were righteous women. But this, it's two different strengths.
Okay, so let me continue? Okay.
Yeah.
Our return to the land of Israel is not merely an event of geopolitical interest, but is primarily designed to inspire the world and further its moral development. Right?
What? Sorry.
The return to the land of Israel, both for Yehoshua and for ourselves, the author is saying, is not simply a geopolitical event, right? It is part of creating a greater world, right? And clearly the enemies of Israel recognize this as well. They recognize this as well. They're willing to damage themselves in order to snuff out what it is that Israel represents.
In accordance with Judaism, is a nation defined by having a land? Is it a must to have a land? Like if you... Again, like you said, the long story.
Clearly, the examples of nationhood always involve land. So I'm not sure if there's a halacha that states this as a requirement.
It's a very interesting question because I think a lot of people actually, for many years, for many hundreds of years, because we didn't have a land, they said we actually don't need a land. It's a point of view now.
By the way, halachically, we never said that. That may be a resignation to the suffering that we were subjected to. But halachically, we never said that. There was never a moment where we didn't say next year in Jerusalem. Never.
But
never.
Clearly stated that no land, no nation was, so Stalin. Stalin was obsessed with this problem. What is a nation? How is it defined when they created the Soviet Union? And the reason to reject Jews as a nation, what Stalin did all the time, they had no land, and plus they had no language. So all hundreds nations in the Soviet Union, when the Soviet Union was created, thoroughly were given their lands. The Soviet Union was a collection of republics, autonomous regions, on and on.
Right.
Smallest nations at the Caucasus, of course, dozens of those.
Right.
Jews were the only nation who were not given anything, and because of that, no land, were identified in Russian as narodность, not people, but little people, something, I don't know.
Group of people. And that's why he wanted to send them all to
So it was scientific.
When was Birobidzhan created?
Where?
Was it created for...
No.
It was created for Jews to show as if it's their...
By the way, and who were great supporters, excuse me, just a few seconds for that, because it's just to the topic, I believe. The Jews who were creators of the revolution, who were comrades of Stalin's Congress, they were the first to contribute into this idea, where the Jews, we have, but it's just the name which is to disappear, we have to assimilate, we have no land, no language, we don't need it. So while even Lenin was alive and Soviet Union was giving lands.
I would argue with you a little bit on this.
No,
you're much more expert than I am, but I would argue, I'd make one point to this, that they were willing to, these Jews that you describe, were willing to forsake their 1,000 years of tradition, right? But they actually weren't willing to forsake their mission, right? Their mission was to create a messianic environment, right? You know, the great idealists of communist dogma were all Jews.
Yeah.
You know, right? You know, they were seeking through a non-religious way to fulfill all the goals of Judaism. That's what they at the beginning.
It was affected by their Jewish education.
Stalin was not, by the way. Stalin was quite different, right? But the idea, and why? Why was Soviet communism so attractive to American intelligentsia and Jews, and the Nazis were so hated? You think it was simply because the Nazis hated Jews from the beginning? No, Stalin hated the Jews too.
Of course.
You know, and he didn't keep it a very big secret, I would say. The difference was that Stalin and you know, took the Stalin and Lenin, etc., and Trotsky, right, took the best of the ideals of making a world of universal health care, of universal literacy, you know, brotherhood, chicken in every pot, right? That's where all their goals. Those are all goals of the prophets. They're all goals of the Torah, right?
Yeah.
Did he corrupt them? Yes. Did he turn them into sewage? For sure.
For sure.
Right? But the Nazis began at that point. And they said, we'll start by ridding the world of these idealists.
So they wanted to control everything.
We want not universal brotherhood. We want the barbarians, the very strongest and most brutal, to rule. Right? That is, of course, what Stalin wanted too, and Beria wanted too. But he didn't say it. He said universal health care.
Right.
Universal well-being, mir, right? And that touched every Jew's heart. Right?
Well,
was it wrong? It was very wrong.
They were too
but it was
naive.
very successful.
And they were naive. Those Jews were naive.
Idealistic. And, they have
They were very
ideals.
naive because they did not read.
But we
through the
continue to this day,
Like
right?
what?
Through one way or another, to seek a messianic solution to the world. That's why we're here,
There is
to bring it about.
You know what?
Utopical idea will never happen.
There is a very,
What?
you know, there is a.
Messianic ideas will never come to the end.
No,
it's
in
like
the-
horizon.
lines. You're talking about messianic
By the way,
idea in the true sense.
By the way,
Not the
on
way-
one level
not the
I
way
agree with
Obama
you.
wants.
On another level I disagree with you. How do I disagree with you? I disagree with you in the sense that if you take God out of the picture, heaven forbid, right? Then for sure you're right. You know, those of us who've looked, you know, to Israel to say, you know, who will it be, you know, that will make the state what it can be, are constantly disappointed. Constantly disappointed, not in who the people are, but how our dreams are crushed. We're counting on this person to be tough and be strong for Israel. We're counting on this person to be smart and make the right deal. And we're always disappointed. Because at the end of the day, it's not dependent on that person. Mm-hmm. And that's actually the thing we have to come to understand. That it is God's hand at play. And we have to do what we can to line ourselves up with that hand. And then Mashiach will come. Then Mashiach will come. And it won't be nearly as shocking as everybody thinks. Actually, it'll be very clear at that point. You know, it doesn't have to be, you know, somebody descending on a white horse from the heavens. Right? You know, the world is getting ready for it. I have to tell you, you know, you see the behavior of Iran, you see the behavior of the Christians, everybody is getting ready for this time. They all view it differently, but they will all recognize it when it happens. All recognize it when it happens. I think we should hold here pretty soon. Let me just try and get to the end of a sentence here, okay? Our return to the land of Israel is not merely an event of geopolitical interest, but is primarily designed to inspire the world and further its moral development. The whole purpose of the Torah, its chronology from the selection of Avraham Avinu to the death of Moshe Rabbeinu, was to create the Jewish people and bring them equipped with the laws of the Torah into the land of Israel, where they would establish a model society. That is why Chazal state the only indispensable books of Tanakh are the 5 books of Moshe and the book of Yehoshua. The Torah for its laws, the book of Yeshua because it describes the conquest and the division of the land of Israel, with the Jewish people residing in the land of Israel, observing Torah. The goal of creation itself was fulfilled, and the Torah found its natural culmination. That's what Messianic times are. I think we probably should hold here. We've been going for a long time. But we're out of Rachav's brothel. That's the good news, right? Yeah. And we're getting ready for the conquest of the land.